All right, so today I figured I would talk to you guys about basically what this whole channel is about, and that's language learning. And yeah, of course, most of all of my videos are in Korean, but I think it'd be fun for most of you because you have background knowledge on the topic for me to talk about acquisition and immersion. And as I always say, learning a foreign language is probably the easiest skill that you can master with putting in almost no effort. Every other skill, whether it's playing the piano, whether it's getting good at a sport like basketball, learning how to tie-dye t-shirts, learning how to make pottery, becoming a barista, all of these skills require a lot of effort. If you don't do the skill, then you're not going to improve. But language learning is the kind of opposite. You don't really have to do a lot. All you have to do is be constantly exposed to the language that you want to learn, right? That's basically what immersion is. So immersion is kind of what the language learning communities in the English world call the acquisition method, which is basically just constantly putting yourself in environments or creating those environments in which the language you want to learn, your target language, the foreign language, is on all the time, right? So if I'm watching a movie for an hour long and it's in a foreign language and there's no subtitles, that's considered immersion. And through immersion, you acquire the language. And so people always think that language learning is like a difficult thing. Oh, it's so hard. You have to practice. You have to memorize. You have to speak. It's not. And you don't have to do any of those things. And even if you don't do any of those things, as long as you are constantly exposed to the language itself, you're going to learn, because that's how our brains are wired. That's how humans are designed by evolution. If we're exposed to a language long enough, then we will pick it up naturally. Now, there are some requirements. There are some, how do you say it? There's some, not requirements, but there are some sort of, yeah, I guess you'll say requirements. There are some requirements. Like, for example, if you want to, well, and I'll start here. I'll make sure I say this. On my channel, or at least in my language learning philosophy that I've spoken about on the internet, it's not for people who are just trying to learn a few phrases, have simple conversations, go traveling and use a few survival phrases. It's not that. Whatever I preach on the internet has always been, if you're trying to get to a native-like level, similar to a native, then this is how you have to learn, right? So that's the context. It's not for, I just want to have like a simple conversation or just like an intermediate level of the language. That'd be fine. No, I'm talking about native-like language, native skills, native-like skills in that foreign language. So the steps are pretty simple. The first thing you have to do is watch a lot and listen a lot. Now, this is actually kind of obvious, right? Which is why people always say, you have to go to a foreign country to learn the language. That's not true. But the truth in that is that when you go to a foreign country and the natives are speaking the language, you're watching and listening. If you're in, let's say you're trying to learn English and you move to Canada, right? And you're seeing natives in real life. You're going to see them talking, so you're going to see their facial expressions, you're going to see their mouths moving, and you're going to hear them. It's eyes and ears, eyes and ears, eyes and ears all the time. But when people aren't in a foreign country, they go, let me study grammar. Like, let me memorize some phrases. Let me use a workbook, right? Although letters and words on a page and books do go through the visual sort of filtering that our brain uses to understand literature or text, it's not even close to the same sort of visual stimulus you get from a real life, like moving sort of action that's coupled with words, language. And so it's much different. I don't think personally, based on what I've read, based on what I've seen, based on what I know, I don't think it's the same. And I don't think it's even close. But when people aren't in a foreign country, all of a sudden they forget the truth that you need eyes and ears all the time on the language. So if I'm watching a TV drama, if I'm watching a movie, if I'm watching natives speak in real life, it's all eyes and ears, eyes and ears, eyes and ears. That's the first step to learning any foreign language. Constantly use your eyes and ears. Always. So right now, for example, if you're learning English and you're watching me, you're using your eyes and ears, right? You're using your eyes and ears to see my hands, to see my face, to see my mouth, to hear the sounds coming out, my expressions. Am I happy? Am I angry? Am I frustrated or am I uncertain? These are all the things that tells our brain what the sounds mean, all the visual stimulus. The visual stimulus tells our brain what the sounds mean. If there is no visual stimulus, then there's no meaning behind the words. So when you're trying to learn a foreign language, and let's say, you go to a foreign country or you don't, either way, if you're an adult, you have to make the environment yourself. So whatever you do in your daily life, besides the things you have to do like work and eat, everything that's in your environment, and besides location, is on you. It's up to you to create that environment. So when you watch Netflix, are you watching Netflix in your native tongue, or are you watching Netflix in your target language? Are you using subtitles or are you taking them off? Are you constantly listening to podcasts in the foreign language? Are you constantly listening to the audio from the shows you've watched in the language? Are you constantly hanging out with friends who speak that language natively? Or are you doing all those things in your mother tongue? It's all based on you, right? So the first step, though, as a beginner, it's very simple. All you have to do is watch and listen, watch and listen, watch and listen. That could be digital, that could be in the real world. But if you're watching this video, at least, then you live in the digital world. So it could be digital. And actually the digital world, it's much more accessible. It's so easy. You just open up your phone and there you go. All of a sudden you have your digital world in front of you. So watching, listening. Then after a long time, many hours of input, you're getting all this visual audio stimulus, all of this video, you're going to pick up the language naturally. So people always say, "Oh, but how do you know something you don't understand?" By being exposed to it. You don't understand it, so you have to be exposed to it, and then eventually your brain does the work. You just understand it. You don't have to put in any effort to understand. As long as you have an environment where you're always listening to the language, then you are going to understand eventually. But it's not like a quick thing. And I know a lot of people say, "Oh, but studying is faster. If I just study and memorize, it'll be faster." As I explained in the last video that I recorded with my friend Didi, it's not faster. If you're trying to get to a native level, the most important skill is hearing words in real time and being able to process them quickly within a context, like rapidly, like we do, right? Like if I'm a native speaker and my friend says a word that I've never heard before, I don't have to study or memorize it. I could just ask them what it means, or I can just infer. I can guess what it means in real time. And that's my language ability. That's what your whole language ability is. When people are talking, you hear words that you don't know, or you hear things that are new, and you try to understand them in real time, right? So developing that skill is the most important skill. So studying actually takes that away. If you study, you're spending less time on developing your in real time acquisition skills. And so in the long run, like I said in that video with Didi, in the long run, if you're studying, it's going to take much longer to understand native-like material or stuff for natives. But in the long run, doing immersion is so much faster. It's a little slower at the start, but it's so much faster if you're trying to get to a native level anyway. If you're trying to get to a native level, it means the language is going to be part of your life, right? So why slow that process down by getting in the way with studying and memorization? You're just taking time away from the chances, the potential chances your brain can just start learning how to guess better, right? Language learning is just seeing something, listening to something, and trying to guess what it means. But you don't have to do that. Your brain will do it as long as you're constantly exposed to the language. And that's the most important part. So in this first step, when it comes to acquiring the language, all you have to do is watch and listen. Then eventually you know a lot. Then eventually you know a lot of words and a lot of sounds and a lot of grammar. After a lot of time put in, then eventually you get to sort of an intermediate level. Now, the way that I break down foreign language learners, there's reading level and non-reading level. There's only two. There's reading level and non-reading level. Reading level means you can start reading in that language. Non-reading level means you still have to just immerse until you understand a majority of the language. So for example, right now in Japanese, I'm at a non-reading level because I can't barely understand most of the stuff I'm listening to or watching, right? So why would I even start reading something that I can't even understand? Reading is based on the idea that we understand a whole amount of a language. If we know the language, then reading it is just breaking down a representation of it on paper. So you gotta basically get to a level where once you could start reading means this. It's let's say, for example, a first grader, right? In elementary school, in first grade, we start to learn to read. Yes, sure, you learn in kindergarten, but even at a kindergarten level, those kids, those native speakers have been exposed to their language, watching and listening for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of hours since they were born. They're probably listening to their native language for at least 5 to 6 to 7 hours a day up until they get to school. So they already know their language really well. Have a conversation with a kindergartner. Their language skills are phenomenal. Why? Because all they do is watch and listen and watch and listen. Now, a lot of people think it's because they speak a lot. Well, that doesn't make sense, right? The only reason you know how to speak is because you understand words. You understand sentences. You can't speak if you don't understand. Understanding always comes first. So when you're immersing in the beginning stage as a beginner and you're trying to get to a reading level, right? People are, how do you learn to speak? By understanding, by listening. If you hear something and you understand it, then you can say it. It's okay that you can't say it how one person said it. It's okay that you can't say it how another person said it. But if you could say it in your own way, that's all that really matters. Because at the end of the day, talking is about communication. So you're trying to communicate your thoughts. Person A has a thought, person B has a thought. I'm going to communicate it through words. If person B doesn't understand the words, it doesn't matter how well they speak if they can't understand the message. So speaking as well, speaking is learned directly from understanding. It's not an indirect relationship, in my opinion. You understand words, you understand sentences, and that's how you learn to speak. Yes, you start to babble a little bit and your pronunciation and your intonation's awkward, but that's fine and it doesn't really matter. But you know kind of what you need to say because you can understand it. That's the whole idea. You can understand things, and so you take the things you understand and then you put them back out in the way that you're forming them with your mouth and your tongue, and that's fine. So you do that, watching and listening up until a reading level. So once you start reading, then things become a little bit different because reading is not natural. Reading doesn't happen in nature. Humans learn to talk and speak and understand naturally without any actual dedicated time or effort to that put to that skill. You're born next to other humans and humans are talking. Humans are going to learn how to speak with each other. That's it. It's in our brains. Our brains are wired to understand languages we're exposed to. But reading text is not. It is not natural. It does not happen in nature. You don't acquire text naturally. It doesn't happen that way. How it happens is instruction, study. So in school or through some sort of education, we learn how to read from an instructor, from instruction. It is very, I can't think of the word now. The only thing in my head that it's popping up is 무의식 and 의식, and I don't remember how to say that in English. Wait, hold on. It's conscious, right? So when we all first learn how to read, it's conscious. We're getting formal instruction in some way. Someone is telling us exactly what each individual letter or word means and how it's pronounced. And at first, when you start reading, yes, you will learn from a teacher, you learn online, you learn in school, it doesn't matter. The requirement, though, is that you already understand the language to a really decent level. Or else, why would you start reading? Because that's what natives do, right? Natives learn reading based on the idea that they already really know the language well. A kindergartner, a first grader knows their language really well. They've been exposed to it for thousands of hours, tens of thousands of hours, probably. So when you start reading, yes, first you need instruction. You need a teacher. You need someone to show you how the letters work. But that instruction, as we've seen it, typically for native speakers is always through the native language. It's not through another language. It's through the native language. When Japanese people learn how to read Japanese, they're learning how to read Japanese, and the instruction is through Japanese. When people who speak English are learning to read the English alphabet, the instruction is through English. Same thing for Koreans. When Koreans are learning how to read the Korean alphabet, the instruction is through Korean. This is more natural and makes sense, right? Because the sounds that Koreans use to explain Korean letters represent them well. English sounds don't. Russian sounds don't. So there's a point when you first start reading where it's instruction. It's instruction based. You have to have a conscious awareness of what the individual letters and or pictographs mean. But what's very interesting about reading to me at least, is that eventually, after a lot of reading practice, you can call it, at some point, your brain starts to acquire the words just like it acquires the audio sounds of the words. The audio version of the words. So all humans will just naturally learn the language if we're exposed to it enough, right? Simple. Okay, cool. But you won't do that with letters, with text. But then, if you read enough text over time, then all of a sudden, like just listening to the language, you actually do start to acquire it subconsciously without having to do it. It becomes natural. It becomes a natural unconscious or a subconscious process. It becomes a subconscious process. And to my knowledge, that's because our brains, it does something basically where it takes the circuits and networks that already exist and it kind of adapts them to understand it as language. And I believe that, to my knowledge, it's because our brain already has an auditory registry of what the meanings of those words that we're seeing actually sound like. So when we read a word, our brain is always processing the auditory version of that word in our head. The pronunciation, the intonation, how it should sound. The part of our brain that processes sounds for words and meanings of words and sentences and all of the language that we know, whenever we read, that part of our brain is turned on. And that's because letters are a visual thing and they get processed through a sort of filter. And it always goes through that process. Even though we don't recognize it, it's always going through that process, right? So eventually, if you read enough, once you get to a reading level, you read enough, then you start to acquire the language then you start to acquire the language, then you start to acquire the language just by reading. And to my knowledge, still, reading is the single best way to increase one's vocabulary efficiently, more than any other language practice. However, the requirement is that you already are a really good reader, right? Then that takes off, and your language levels will go crazy. So, like in a nutshell, in a really, really, really big nutshell, language learning is very, very, very simple. If you want to get to a native-like level, it's watch and listen all the time. Another way to say that is immerse all the time. Now, in the Korean YouTube world, in Korean YouTube or in the Korean online world, probably because of my channel, I do believe that the operative word there is 습득, right? Because it kind of translates to acquisition or to acquire. But in Korean, it doesn't really, like, immersion is not really a word that exists because there was no 통념. I don't know 통념. There's no like general idea of, oh yeah, this is a thing that you should do, right? So I decided to call this activity 습득 because it kind of relays the idea that you should always be watching and listening all the time. But in the English in the English speaking communities where people talk about language learning, they usually say immersion, not acquisition. Acquisition is sort of what happens when you immerse. But the point is that it's very simple. When you're a beginner, all you have to do is watch the language all the time, listen to the language all the time, and that's it. If you do that, you learn to speak. You learn to understand. You learn everything you need to know. Then, once you've acquired a lot of the language and you get to a reading level, and let's just say for argument's sake, the reading level is about the language ability of a first grader. Because yes, around the world, that is kind of when most kids learn to read. Now, some countries, like in Europe, they wait till third grade because there's a lot of reasons behind that. But the point is, on average, if you're a first grader in your native language and you're going to school, you're going to start to learn to read. But by that point, you've already acquired your native tongue and you've been exposed to it for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of hours. So yeah, you're at a reading level. So once you get to a first grade level, you could start to read. And yes, you will need instruction. I think on my Q&A video 8, Q&A video 9 or 10, I believe. I can't remember which one. I talk about how to start reading. But here, how you start reading, I'll say it in English now again, is yes, you get direct instruction, whether it's an online course, whether it's a teacher, but it should be through that language. And then you read. You don't have to analyze text. You just read a lot. Picture books, novels, whatever you want to read, it does not matter. You guys already know what I believe about choosing which content to choose. You should always just choose the content that you want to read, that you want to watch, that you want to listen to. That's all that matters. But yeah, read. Or you read. It's hard. You don't know how to do it. You see how words are pronounced, and then once you got used to reading, you just read all the time. That you read all the time, and that's how you get to a native level, right? So okay, I'll break it down again. Okay. Beginner, watch and listen until you get to a reading level. So first grade level. Then for a few months, just learn how to read, learn the alphabet, learn the pictographs, whatever language you're learning, doesn't matter. You just learn how to read. And then once you have the basics, you start to read a lot. You're not trying to analyze stuff. You're just reading. Spending your time reading. Doesn't matter if you don't know it. Then, eventually you will have gotten used to reading. And once you're used to reading, you just keep doing that. You keep reading. And once you've read a lot, you'll probably surpass a lot of native speakers, because a lot of native speakers don't even read books. Actually, I don't even read books in English, which is funny. I've read more books in Korean than I have in English. But that's how you learn a foreign language. It's so simple. It's so simple. Watch and listen, watch and listen, watch and listen. Reading level, learn to read, 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 read. That is, in a nutshell, how you learn. Obviously, there are so many more little fine details we could talk about. And on my channel, you guys know that I talk about those details, about those questions. But that is, in a nutshell, how you learn to speak a language. People, oh, but how do you speak? I just explained it. Same thing. Watch and listen, watch and listen, watch and listen, watch and listen, watch and listen. And you will know how to speak. It's that simple. So, I'll leave you with this. How about this? And I said this in my last video, but I'll say it in English. Here's a good tip. If you're making your target language the number one priority of your life, if learning English, for example, is the number one priority for you right now, then your phone should be in English. You should only watch English YouTube. You should only watch movies in English. You should only watch shows in English. You should only hang out with people who speak English. Now, aside from things you like that are necessities in your life, like speaking to your family, maintaining friendships with your friends, aside from that, all your new experience, put them in English if it's really your number one priority, because it's actually not that hard. It's very simple. So, yeah. So, okay, let me know in the comments what kind of things you want us to talk about, and then we'll make good content for you guys. All right. I hope you enjoyed it, and keep immersing, and make sure your environment is set to English if you're learning English. If you're learning Japanese, set your environment to Japanese. If you're learning Tagalog, set your environment to Tagalog, right? So right now, that TV for me is my Japanese TV. I always have Japanese on that TV and nothing else, because that's how I can create an environment of learning and immersion. Okay, see you later. And if you don't have time right now, save this next video to your watch later playlist. So when you do have time, grab a cup of coffee and give it a watch. That action alone helps the I Speak Korean Pretty Well podcast quite a lot. Thank you.